I call on Gillian Martin to speak to and move to the motion.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am pleased to open this afternoon's debate on meeting the challenges of climate change. Despite the majority of people in Scotland recognising that climate change is an immediate and urgent problem, we're witnessing a concerning rise in anti-climate rhetoric from those who would seek to sow division. And I'm proud that Scotland continues to stand firm in our commitment to tackle the twin crises of climate change and nature loss, the impacts of which are already evident across Scotland and indeed the world. We know that they will intensify and be the cause of potential incidents that will directly affect our citizens, so we must increase our climate resilience. We also know that action must accelerate to deliver our statutory emissions reductions targets, and because we have such a model obligation to decarbonise as fast as possible. As such, I can confirm that I will support Claire Baker's amendment from the Labour benches, but I must clarify that on the basis that the referenced interim targets mentioned in the Labour motion actually refers to the now statutory carbon budget approach to reach net zero by 2045, given that there are no longer interim targets in legislation. However, in doing so, I must stress that accelerating the pace of change will not be easy. Yes.
Claire Baker.
I'm happy just to confirm that the amendment does refer to the carbon budgeting and the changes we have to the 5-year targets.
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. That's very helpful, because I was keen that the content of the motion was something I did want to support. It was just an issue with wording there, so I'm pleased to be able to confirm that we will vote for the Labour amendment. The pace of change is not going to be easy, and it will only be achievable if those of us who believe in climate change work together instead of offering opposition for opposition's sake. This has been regrettably all too common in previous parliaments. The people we represent expect better. They expect disagreement, yes, they expect debate, but above all, they expect and they want collaboration, action and progress. And I'm prepared to deliver that with willing colleagues. And we are making progress. For example, this year we have significantly exceeded our programme for government target on peatland restoration, with 15,448 hectares restored, for example. And we have also committed £110 million to peatland restoration over the next 4 years, giving that sector certainty and seeing the potential of jobs growth realised. Alongside the necessary accelerated action, we will also continue to set out more detail on delivery planning. I intend to convene a cross-government delivery group on climate action to support this and strengthen delivery monitoring across the whole of government. Presiding Officer, delivering climate action means investing in our economic future and improving the lives of our citizens. Scotland's blessed with vast natural resources, creative communities and businesses and exceptional people. This gives us a huge competitive advantage to seize the opportunities of the industries of the future. The transition already underway is not only our path to decarbonisation, but it's also central to our industrial resilience and our long-term competitiveness as a country. However, we'll only succeed in achieving that if we deliver a fair and just transition. A recent report from the Confederation of British Industry shows the lead that Scotland has over the rest of the UK with net zero related activity, contributing a total of £10.2 billion to Scotland's economy, supporting over 105,000 jobs. For every £1 of direct economic value generated in this sector, a further £1.75 is supported across the wider Scottish economy. Households and businesses will also see direct financial benefits due to the switch to, for example, electric vehicles. Including the electrification of heavy goods vehicles, it means lower operating and maintenance costs across the economy and less vulnerability to any kind of fluctuation in fossil fuel prices, shocks that are caused in a geopolitical situation which we've seen this year in particular. This government's significant investments in concessionary public transport are also making it easier and more affordable to switch. In addition, our £2 bus fare cap is now active across the Highlands and Islands and supporting rural connectivity and tourism. And this SNP government will go even further, putting in place the £2 bus fare cap across the whole of Scotland by the end of this Parliament. Climate action is improving the quality of our lives. Active travel isn't just reducing emissions, it also means increased physical activity and the health benefits that comes from that. The switch to EVs, means clearer air that reduces our risk of respiratory and cardiovascular diseases, meaning long-term and significant health budget savings. The Edinburgh Climate Change Institute estimate that these co-benefits are worth £1,450 per person over the 15-year period of the new climate change plan, not least by reducing pressure on our National Health Service. And that figure does not even include the £42 billion of financial benefits directly attributable to the plan up to 2040. Climate action is now at the heart of Scotland's economy, our public health and our wider society. But let's drill down into particular areas of Scotland. The CBI report demonstrated that climate action is driving the economy of Aberdeen, my home city, Europe's energy capital, and also Perth and Kinross, where the sector supports 12% of gross value added. In fact, 19 out of Scotland's 32 local authority areas have over 3 times more net zero businesses than the UK average, compared to the overall number of businesses in their area. And this includes North Lanarkshire, where there are 8.8 times more than the UK average. Net zero activity in Glasgow and Edinburgh together supports £3.8 billion in gross value added, when including the wider supply chain and spillover effects. The net zero economy is the economy. The bedrock of this trend is our small and medium-sized enterprises that make up about 90% of the companies in the so-called green sector. Let's now look at the impacts of climate change in Scotland as we are feeling them. From wildfires to flooding to coastal erosion, we know that climate change is causing more serious and more unpredictable impacts across the whole of Scotland. These trends are getting worse and they threaten our livelihoods and the safety of our communities. They risk damage to our homes, our landscapes, our businesses, our infrastructure. Insurance becomes more difficult to obtain and afford for families and businesses, because once an event's happened, then the premium's going up. And that's if you ever had insurance in the first place. And I won't be the only MSP in the event of a flood who has had to visit households who did not have insurance at all and are devastated. Presiding Officer, the Climate Change Committee is clear that the effects of climate change are costing Scotland billions of pounds each year. And that's only likely to increase if we do not take the action necessary to reduce our emissions and adapt to the impacts already with us. I will.
Finlay Carson.
I appreciate the Cabinet Secretary give way, but unfortunately this sounds like the usual broken record where the Scottish Government are cherry-picking certain statistics. So if everything's so good, why is it that the Climate Change Committee suggested we should be planting 18,000 hectares of trees, where the Scottish Government's reduced goal is 10,000, and maybe the Cabinet Secretary could update the Chamber on actually how many hectares were planted in 24-25?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I would be happy to give that very molecular detail to Finlay Carson after this. Obviously, I'm not cherry-picking particular incidents. I'm actually going through some of the areas on which there has been a great deal of progress, but I'm also outlining where we need to go further as well. And I don't think that characterising what I've been saying as a broken record is exactly conducive to the collaborative relationship that I want to have with the Conservative benches, particularly in view of having so many new members who perhaps aren't with the agenda on this and don't see the benefits. If I could go back to adaptation, which I was talking about, Professor Graham Roy of the Scottish Fiscal Commission has said, and this is a direct quote, "Not responding to the challenge of climate change will be far more expensive and damaging to the public finances than investing in net zero. It's simply not an option." Now, that is the Scottish Fiscal Commission. Our third Scottish National Adaptation Plan is our blueprint to build that resilience to climate change in a way that's fair and equitable, but is also potentially saving millions of pounds of potential damage. Collaboration is at its heart, including with local government. Our climate change plan is accelerating, as I've said, the rollout of EV chargers. We delivered nearly £4 million of grant funding to 120 organisations to specifically support the installation of 250 charge points in rural and island locations. And we've introduced the Rural and Islands Infrastructure Fund, more than doubled it to £10 million to enable that expansion of that infrastructure. And the bridge between climate mitigation and adaptation is also the restoration of our natural environment. We know that climate regulates nature and nature regulates climate. Both are inseparable and symbiotic. Today, I announced new funding of nearly £1 million for the Forth, Clyde, Fife and Lothians climate forests, which will contribute not just to our woodland creation targets, which Mr Carson has exercised about, but also provide green spaces, flood resilience and opportunities for our people, particularly in urban environments where we need to be improving those neighbourhoods and giving children in particular access to nature. The funding will also help us reach our plans to increase woodland cover to 23% by 2040. Yesterday I visited Dulloch Park and Classwoods, part of the Fife Climate Forest, where I met local partners and community groups, see firsthand how they're working together to boost the number of trees in Fife, improve access to high-quality, vibrant green spaces that produce thriving, resilient places for people as well as nature, mitigating against flooding, giving families places to do leisure activities, planting community gardens to provide food, and often turning derelict wasteland into beautiful, safe spaces that make areas more pleasant to live in and bring people together. We're also committed to working with the Scottish Outdoor Recreation Alliance and others to develop a Scottish Pass Fund and produce new guidance for access authorities on how to fulfil their responsibilities. We've also invested over £75 million in the Nature Restoration Fund on a huge amount of diverse projects, supporting the planting of 300,000 trees, 216 kilometres of habitat protected. But the Nature Restoration Fund isn't just restoring Scotland's nature, it's also strengthening the economy. It has supported projects that create jobs, develop skills, attract additional private investment. Over £7 million has so far been leveraged in match funding from the private sector. I will in a second. These projects also help to reduce future spending on issues like flooding, wildfires, building long-term resilience to climate change and its impacts. So I'll say that again. Over £7 million has been leveraged as a result of the funding of the Nature Restoration Fund. I'll take
Mark Ruskell.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving way? And I'm enjoying much of what she's laying out in her speech. But one thing that she hasn't mentioned is the industrial decline in Scotland and the need to get just transition for workers in Mossmorran, for transition at other sites like Dunbar, like Grangemouth, where we need to see an industrial future, but we need to take investors and we need to take workers with us. Can the Cabinet Secretary say more about what this government is doing to actually lead on that just transition, rather than leaving it to markets and corporates to determine the future, which is often just leaving Scotland?
I don't believe that we are leaving it to corporates. We are using our funding to leverage in investment from companies as well to actually make that money work harder. Just Transition Fund in the North East, obviously, is an example I'm going to give. Obviously, Stephen Gethins has now got responsibility for that fund. But I would say that I'm not mentioning specific incidents in that space, but I have mentioned Just Transition and making the point more broadly that we have to seize the opportunities that are there with climate action, which also will create jobs. And we need to accelerate that action. As we accelerate that action, we'll build market certainty and we'll create new markets as well, which will providing new jobs and boosting those businesses. And I think I've made quite a lot of mention of the amount of the businesses GVA that it's bringing to Scotland. We've also committed £350 million to over 3,400 businesses through the Agri-Environment Climate Scheme, which will help farmers and crofters embed climate adaptation and resilience into their land management, helping maintain the long-term capacity of our land to produce the food we need and sustain the businesses that produce it. I have more to say, but I believe that I am running out of time. I will end on this note. We will not allow continued deindustrialisation to create new scars in our community. Mark Ruskell is right to point out that we do need a just transition. We do not want to replicate the mistakes of the 1980s. We do need to see action, however, on electricity prices, because there's not much of a silver bullet available to people in policy. But if there is one thing that I would ask for that would unlock so much more, particularly in the just transition space, particularly in having some of the emissions reductions measures, meaning that more people could adapt them in their own homes, it would be the cost of electricity. We must see it come down. We must see it decoupled from gas. And with those kind of interventions, that we would really see us not just meeting our targets, but potentially exceeding them. And I just want to make the point that although I will be accepting the Labour motion today, it is deeply disappointing that the reform motion reiterates their denial of climate change actually being a real pressing issue, and I hope to be able to talk some sense into them over the next few years, because hopefully I've laid out the economic benefits associated with climate action. This is not a cost, this is a cost benefit. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
I now call on Claire Baker to speak to and move Amendment 434.2.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. We need to be clear that climate change is an emergency. It affects communities across the world and increasingly here in Scotland. We are seeing more extreme weather events, increased flooding risks to biodiversity, pressures on food production and growing risks to public health and infrastructure. Climate change does not stop just because some people don't believe in it. The scientific evidence is clear, the need for action is urgent and the responsibility of government to deliver is undeniable. Successive Scottish Parliaments have recognised that reality, and while delivery has sometimes fallen short, the need to act has largely been accepted. Returning to the environment brief after some 10 years, I have to say, struck by the extent to which the political consensus around climate action appears to be weakening, and that should concern all of us. The challenge cannot be whether we agree on the destination, but whether we're making enough progress to get there. If governments repeatedly set ambitious targets but fail to demonstrate progress, people inevitably begin to question whether change is really happening. We cannot allow frustration with delivery to become an argument against action itself. So that is why our amendment today is... happy to.
Cabinet Secretary.
Would she agree, though, that it is not just for government on its own? It has to be a Parliament determination of the willing and a coalition of the willing within this Parliament and also wider society to be reaching those targets.
Claire Baker.
I do agree with that to a certain extent, but government does have the levers and has the government's there to provide the leadership and the drive to make things happen. And while collectively across the Parliament, I think I've made it clear we have agreed that we need to make progress on these targets, and the targets are binding, legally binding by agreement through the Parliament, and the committees have an important role to play here, but it is ultimately, I think, it's government that have to take leadership on this. So Scotland does not have a shortage of climate targets. What we have is a shortage of evidence that we are moving quickly enough to meet them. There remains a persistent gap between the commitments that have been made and the progress that has been delivered. Devolved policy areas are where many of the emissions reductions we need to see have to come from, whether that is transport, low-carbon heat in our homes or nature restoration. These are all areas where we need to see faster progress. The recent emissions statement demonstrated that reality. Emissions reductions have slowed, our carbon footprint is moving in the wrong direction, and unless we increase the pace of change, we will struggle to meet future targets. The figures matter because every year that progress slows, the scale of the challenge becomes even greater. And delaying action today simply means steeper and more difficult changes tomorrow. The publication of the draft Climate Action Plan at the end of the last year was a missed opportunity for the Scottish Government, as it failed to provide the necessary focus on delivery. Stakeholders were looking for confidence that Scotland has a credible pathway to meeting its carbon budgets. The concern was not about ambition, it was about whether the measures identified were sufficient, they were detailed enough and, above all, capable of being implemented. The Cabinet Secretary has described the plan as a roadmap, but a roadmap does not just show the destination, it has to show how you intend to get there. Scotland does need a clearer pathway to meeting its carbon budgets, and Parliament needs better tools to monitor progress along the way. We have seen positive changes, including greater scrutiny and a greater focus on carbon budgets. However, there remain significant gaps in how progress will be measured and monitored. I am keen to hear more from the Cabinet Secretary about the priority actions being taken forward, how progress will be reported to Parliament and how the cross-government group referenced in the emissions statement will help deliver change. And some of this she has referred to in her opening statement, but I look forward to more detail. Because scrutiny is not an obstacle to climate action, it is essential to climate action. We do recognise that action on climate change is shared across individuals, communities, private companies, the public sector and others, as well as government. But as I said earlier, it is the government who hold the levers of power. For local authorities, households and communities to help drive the transition, they need the proper support to do so. For many families, climate policy is not an abstract discussion about emissions. It's about whether they can afford to heat their homes, whether their home is energy efficient and whether they can reduce their energy bills. People want warmer homes, lower bills and cleaner energy, but too many households still face barriers when it comes to improving energy efficiency or installing low-carbon technologies. Improving energy efficiency should be one of the most effective ways of reducing emissions, tackling fuel poverty and lowering household bills. Yet we know that progress on retrofitting Scotland's housing stock remains too slow and too many households are still waiting for practical support. We also need to explore how technologies such as solar power, battery storage and heat pumps can work together to decarbonise homes while helping families manage energy costs. So domestic transport does remain our largest source of emissions, and it's a clear example of the gap between ambition and delivery. Last year, the Scottish Government scrapped its own target to reduce car kilometres by 20% by 2030 because it failed to put in place the policies necessary to achieve it. And while there has been expansion and investment in EV infrastructure, it does now seem we're increasingly relying on the switch from petrol and diesel to EVs instead of delivering a wider transformation of our transport system. Yes.
Cabinet Secretary.
I mean this intervention in the spirit of working together, but I would say that one of the issues has been the decision to tax EV drivers per mile. We should not see this as a retrograde step when we're wanting to see more people access EVs.
Claire Baker.
My understanding is that that is a consultation at the moment, which is just closed. And I know some of the pressure is coming from the cost that we put onto rural transport, people who live in rural areas, but we recognise that rural car ownership is always more expensive. And if people don't have alternatives to using their car, we need to invest more in public transport and make sure that people have alternatives to using the car and come out with their cars, and we can actually deliver modal shift, because while EVs are part of the solution, it has to sit alongside public transport. And there's too many people in Scotland who don't have access to a network that actually meets their needs. People understand the need to reduce transport emissions, but they also know that if a bus doesn't turn up, if the train is still too expensive, or if there's no public transport option at all, they will continue to rely on their cars. That is why we need genuine alternatives through reliable public transport, better bus services, improved rail connectivity and safer active travel routes. So the reintroduction of off-peak fares was welcome in helping tackle the cost of rail travel. However, the government's own analysis suggested it did not deliver the significant modal shift that had been hoped for. Achieving that shift remains one of the biggest transport challenges that we face. Climate action must also work for rural Scotland. Our farmers and crofters already experience the impacts of climate change, including increasing uncertainty around production. They are essential partners in this transition, and while we have seen emissions from agriculture reduce over recent decades, much of that reduction has coincided with declining livestock numbers. We agree that meeting agricultural emissions targets cannot simply rely on reducing livestock numbers. Farmers need support to adopt new technologies and lower carbon practices, while being able to maintain a thriving food-producing sector. Yeah.
Cabinet Secretary.
Would the member accept that the Scottish Government and this Parliament have made the necessary injections of cash into agriculture by making sure we continue with direct payments, by continuing voluntary coupled supports, by continuing to have a ring-fence fund for cattle production in this country, while in England, introduced by the Tories, continued by the Labour Party, is decimating agriculture?
Claire Baker.
I wouldn't agree with that analysis, and I don't think it really recognises the reality that farmers are dealing with. And when I met with NFU myself this week, they are calling for clarity around the money they have to get from the Scottish Government. And, well...
So, members mustn't interrupt.
And what I was going to go on to say is that while we agree with maintaining livestock numbers, although livestock numbers have come down themselves because of market forces, we need to make sure that the funding framework does support the kind of transformation we need to see in farming. And I don't think the way in which the government has set it out, if you look at what they've done in England and Wales, there's clearer links between the money that is distributed to farmers with the transformation they need to make in terms of farming practices. Briefly,
Cabinet
I
Secretary.
was comfortable with the fact that a BPS down in England that used to be worth £40,000 is now worth £600. Do you think that's the right way to give farmers certainty?
Claire Baker.
I've made it clear that farming and agriculture is an important part. It is, the emissions in Scotland come from agriculture, transport and housing and building. And the government don't seem to be setting out the ways in which they think they can support agriculture to make the shift. And the Minister's talking about supporting the agricultural sector, but not talking about the subject of the debate was about how do we deal with emissions in the sector. And I've already said that we wouldn't look at reducing livestock numbers. The livestock numbers are already coming down because of market forces. But what do we do? And what I'm going to go on to say is we need to look at the funding network and make sure that we work with farmers and we use the potential we have to encourage and incentivise low-carbon farming and greening practices through the payment system. Now, the Minister seems quite excited by the fact that I'm saying this, as if it's something that the government don't support, but my understanding is the government does support to reduce emissions within the agricultural sector. And I'd like a clearer idea of how they plan to do that. So Scotland's natural environment is one of the greatest assets, but biodiversity continues to decline and many species and habitats remain under pressure. Nature restoration is a key part of our response to climate change. Healthy ecosystems help store carbon, they improve resilience to extreme weather and support sustainable economic activity. But again, there are questions over whether our ambition is translating into projects on the ground. Communities, land managers and environmental organisations need certainty on support and investment alongside clear targets for nature restoration. This same applies to marine environment. Our seas support biodiversity, sustain coastal communities and have an important role in carbon storage. But protecting marine ecosystems needs effective management, robust monitoring and meaningful engagement with those whose livelihoods depend on our seas. I have taken a number of interventions. Am I able to continue, or would you like me to?
You should be winding up. I would recommend that you don't take any more interventions and that you move to closing.
Thank you. I was going to say something about tree planting, but the Cabinet Secretary's announcement on climate forests this afternoon is welcome. I think there's more we can do in that area. We know that transition to net zero presents huge opportunities for Scotland and we have the natural resources and ability to help deliver this transformation. Alongside opportunity, we need leadership, delivery and government that can provide clear and credible plans for implementation. Ambition alone will not reduce emissions, targets alone will not restore nature. We need faster progress on decarbonising transport, improving energy efficiency of our homes, supporting communities and businesses through the transition and restoring our natural environment. And I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you very much. I now call on Duncan Massey to speak to and move Amendment 434.4. Duncan Massey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Let me begin with a simple but important distinction. Global warming is real and it's a problem, but it is not an emergency. And that distinction really matters because it shapes how we respond, because make no mistake, our current policies are failing. They're disproportionate and they're unilateral and they're causing the closure of industry and driving huge energy bills while actually having zero effect on global emissions. In Scotland, most obviously, these policies have driven the closure of the refinery at Grangemouth, of Musmoran, and they're causing huge damage to our North Sea oil and gas industry. And it also matters because emotive terms like emergency and crisis are simply not supported by the science. No, because I'm about to go into my argument on that.
The member does not need to take an intervention. Duncan Massey.
It's not supported by the science. The IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, has quietly removed its RCP 8.5 scenario, once again highlighting that the scientific consensus is a slow and mild warming with another 1 to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century as the mid-term estimate. And what are the real impacts of this warming? Again, the IPCC do see the likely emergence of more heat waves, but they don't see a climate change signal for river floods, heavy rainfall, drought of all types, severe windstorms or tropical storms. Yes.
Lloyd Melville.
I thank him for that. However, I would just gently point out that in my own constituency, I watched people evacuated from their own homes by boat because of severe rainstorms and severe river flooding. Does he accept that? Does he accept that reality of the climate change that we are facing right now?
Duncan Massey.
I'd reiterate the science that the IPCC do not see that as a trend. They do not see that as a trend. That's the science. You can see individual events, and quite often when we look at it, what you'll see is a failure to dredge rivers, a failure to, you'll have building on floodplains, and you'll have all these factors that also contribute strongly. And one comment I would make is the IPCC also do not currently attribute wildfire occurrence to climate change. They do see an increase in dry and simultaneous and windy weather, which can influence it, but they highlight that wildfires are more dependent on land use and nearby human activity to provide ignition and fuel. And the Dava Moor fire is a case in point. The fire was started by a flare during a Coast Guard exercise. Whilst there was extremely dry weather, it was exacerbated by more increased fuel due to less controlled burns and land use changes, which resulted in less fire breaks and less gamekeepers available to fight the incident. Yes, it will.
Minister.
The facts of the Dava wildfire went through every landscape. It didn't matter what it was on, whether it was on forestry, whether it was on wetland, whether it was on peatland, or whether it was on managed land. So it's not quite correct to say that the only reason that the Dava fire had the scale it had was because that the land hadn't been managed. That's simply not correct.
Duncan Massey.
It was certainly contributory. So, again, let's be science and fact-based about this problem, and let's acknowledge that climate change sits alongside other problems, such as lack of growth, lack of jobs, cost of living crisis. And unfortunately, our policies have made these interconnected problems. So we need to ensure that our responses are pragmatic and long-term. And we need to ensure that policy is focused on the needs of people rather than really arbitrary emission targets. Because, let's be clear, our current net zero policies are not working. They're not proportionate. Firstly, they're not having any actual impact. Our emissions, Scotland's emissions, are 0.08% of global emissions, or about 1 day of Chinese emissions. And as the Scottish Government's own data showed, our emissions have been flat since 2020. No declines, despite huge amounts of the taxpayers' money being thrown at the problem. And secondly, these net zero policies are driving huge costs that are deindustrialising the whole country and driving up our energy bills. Yes, I will.
Cabinet Secretary.
I think it's important to point out the actual facts and the data support that Scotland's emissions have halved since 1990 as a result of climate action. I also make reference to the GVA that I've mentioned in my speech as well. While these emissions have dropped, the productivity has gone up.
Duncan Massey.
The emissions fell since 1990 due to us moving to gas away from coal. Look up your own chart and your own report. Last 5 years are flat. I'll come to the GVA next in the CPI report. I do think it's mistaken analysis, because the costs of current policy are driving a fragile energy system with some of the most expensive energy in the world. Industrial energy costs double that of the US, 4 times that of China. We've nearly lost our primary steel industry, our chemical, pharmaceutical, ceramics all being hammered, our oil and gas being closed down. We no longer produce our own fertiliser, and across the board manufacturing is uncompetitive due to these high costs. And I think it's all the more futile when we recognise that these materials still get produced, just not here. They get produced abroad and then imported with far higher emissions. Now, of course, there are jobs in renewables, and I welcome them. I do think the CBI report overstates it, because it includes many industries such as waste, water, utilities, forestry, people in advocacy groups. The actual jobs associated with renewables in Scotland is around 16,000, and that's from the ONS statistics. It is. And
Cabinet Secretary shouldn't interrupt from a secondary position. Duncan Massey.
And obviously, these jobs are not necessarily in the areas which are being affected by these industrial closings, and certainly, not in the same numbers. And these renewables all depend on massive subsidy, which ends up on people's bills. And there's another uncomfortable truth. Some of the policies that we're pursuing do massive environmental harm themselves. Yes, I will.
Heather Anderson.
That there's no industry more subsidised than nuclear, although that seems to be what you're suggesting. So the subsidy for nuclear far outstretches, historically what has gone into renewables.
Duncan Massey.
I personally don't recognise that. There's no, the CFD scheme driving renewables is extremely high. Anyway, continuing with my point, we know that the supply chain for basic metals, rare earths, are hugely polluting. I'd like to move on with my speech.
He's already moved into additional time, so he won't be able to take interventions. Duncan Massey.
Berwick Bank, we know that it's expected to kill tens of thousands of birds, but apparently that's not a problem. Rushed through in the name of stopping climate change. And all this is happening in a world that's changing rapidly. We've got a new geopolitical era, with major powers, United States, China, and an emerging India. One where conflict might very well re-emerge, one where we have AI emerging as the key technology. And what do all these things need? They need energy. Reliable, cheap, abundant energy. That's what success in this new world is going to need. And that means making sensible choices, balancing choices. It means we must maximise our domestic oil and gas resources in the short to medium term. It means planning for the long term by investing in reliable large-scale solutions like nuclear, with renewables playing an important but complementary role. And this is how we secure cheap energy for everyone, ensure that we protect and add to our industrial base, protect our world-leading oil and gas industry and downstream petrochemicals industry, and ensure that we keep the lights on for Scotland's future while we reduce long-term carbon emissions over the long term in a pragmatic, sensible and proportionate way. Thank you very much.
The member may wish to move his amendment. You may wish to move your amendment.
Oh, thank you. I do move my amendment.
I now call on Mark Ruskell to speak to and move amendment 434.3.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and happy to move the amendment in my name. Now, climate change is the biggest crisis, and it's also the biggest opportunity we have now and in the future. And to be honest, having listened to that, I don't want to get drawn into a scientifically illiterate debate about whether climate change is real or not. We had that 25 years ago. The question now is about how we move forward and how we actually act to protect the economy, to protect people and protect the environment. No. The first half of our journey in Scotland to net zero has brought big benefits. A revolution in renewable energy that has stripped fossil fuels out of our electricity supply and has brought a strong degree of energy security in Scotland. But there have also been challenges. Transition has often been unplanned. Economic and community benefits have not met their full potential. And the next half of the journey must be better and it must be fairer. It must take workers and communities on that journey. It must protect people from cost of living shocks while delivering benefits to our health and our environment that make sense in their own right. And there certainly has been a right-wing media tirade against climate action. 70% of recent articles on climate were framed negatively. But it would be wrong to assume that public opinion has turned against climate action. A study commissioned by the IPPR a couple of months ago showed that 62% of the UK public back strong climate action. And when it comes to individual policies, such as traffic reduction, frequent flyer taxes and low-carbon home heating, these remain popular policies with the public. The same study showed that 54% of people believe that the best way to secure energy security is to expand renewable energy, not double down on oil and gas production. And despite what some politicians may dream of, we can't wind the clock back to the 1970s. The trajectory, with or without new fields like Rosebank, is decline. Transition must accelerate to protect jobs from a cliff edge and to protect our energy security. But there's clearly a gulf between what politicians believe is public opinion and what it really is. And I was slightly taken aback by Claire Baker's comment at the beginning of her speech, where she seemed to be sort of making the point that this consensus for climate action in the public has gone away. I don't think it has. I think it's the political caution which is going to leave us more vulnerable to climate change. Yeah.
Claire Baker. It's not to be it's just so I'm not misrepresented. I think you can state that the public do, and I've got evidence myself, the public do support climate action quite strongly. But I think the general discourse around climate, since I last had this portfolio, has got much more divisive, and whether there's certain voices that are amplified through channels, social media channels in particular, maybe overstates their views and makes it seem more than it is. But I do accept that the public are very much largely in favour of us taking action in this area.
Mark Ruskell.
Well, that's good. That's good to hear. And I think we need to set this next session of the Scottish Parliament off on a degree of consensus here. And I think the point that I'm making about the media effectively driving this climate denialism is a real concern, because I think public opinion for the solutions that work is really strong. I think the real risk here is political caution, which is going to leave us more vulnerable to climate change while failing to secure the benefits of action for people and the economy. And I think this government really needs to listen to what the electorate told it in the Holyrood elections, because those under the age of 30 overwhelmingly voted for the Scottish Green Party, for a party that puts climate action first. That's why there are record numbers of Green MSPs in this Parliament. It's why the former First Minister's constituency is now a Green seat, and why there's Green representation now in every region of Scotland for the first time. And that generation is the future of Scotland and our politics. It's a generation that cares about what is coming in 2050, and if political parties also want a future, they need to listen. Because that generation sees the worsening extremes of weather, the displacement of people around the world, the wars that are coming due to shortages of water, food and oil, and they're anxious about what kind of a world they will raise their own children into. But they're also hungry for the opportunities, the new jobs that can come from engineering a better future, a well-being economy that reinvests wealth in community, caring and nature. This generation of young people is also the first whose prospects look worse than the generation that came before it. So it's no wonder they're angry and disheartened. They've heard so many promises, but they've also been let down time and time again. They deserve so much better. Now, countless times I've stood in this chamber and reminded this government of the challenges that we face, that we're behind on delivering climate action and will face a desperate race to catch up in the decades ahead. That hitching our hopes on unproven technology like carbon capture and storage is a huge gamble, because if they don't materialise, other sectors like land use, transport will face more pressure to reduce emissions even faster. And that ignoring simple programmes to make homes, for example, cosier and cheaper, or to radically improve our public transport is a real missed opportunity. Yes, we've made some progress, but this government must show it is ready for the challenges of 2050 rather than 2007. And if not, failure will come at a high cost. We can't cut ourselves off from the impacts of global climate change like Reform would want us to do, just as we can't opt out of global action by pretending Scotland doesn't have huge advantages compared to other countries in reducing our emissions. In a world where every country will have challenges, there is no advantage for Scotland to be in a slow lane, no advantage at all. But there is every advantage in being among the first movers. Now, I welcome the focus of the Cabinet Secretary on delivery in this session. We have spent too long debating targets in this chamber without action. The climate plan sets out a pathway, but it doesn't commit to the detailed programmes that can be felt positively by everybody. Success or failure will come down to the political will of the whole government to lead and support sectors to deliver. It will need every Cabinet Secretary to not just mention climate change from time to time in speeches, but to climate-proof every budget, every programme, to prioritise long-term thinking and to take risks. And if this government does that, it will have a majority for climate action in the chamber with the Scottish Greens. If it doesn't, it will be letting down future generations, and it will be them who suffer the consequences.
Mr Ruskell, could you move your amendment? I'm sorry if you've already done it.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I did at the beginning.
Thank you. Call Finlay Carson to speak and move amendment 434.5.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I move the motion in my name. Presiding Officer, we all recognise the reality and impacts of climate change. Emissions must fall and Scotland must improve climate resilience, and we must protect our natural environment. So yes, we support an affordable transition to net zero, but if this Parliament is not serious about climate change, this government must be serious about delivery. Because a target never planted a tree, a press release never restored a peatland, and a slogan never protected a rural job. Rural communities need certainty, not more delay. And that's the problem. Ambitious targets are set, missed, revised, and confidence is lost. Our amendment recognises Scotland's commitment to net zero by 2045, but it also recognises what ministers too often avoid. Delivering that target will require major changes across the economy. Public confidence depends on credible targets, achievable plans and honesty about trade-offs. That's what is missing. Yes, I'll give way.
Cabinet Secretary.
A few times now, both in this chamber and in the meetings that I've been having with colleagues, so that I want to work with them as much as possible. What was in the Conservatives' manifesto policy that would have brought down emissions that we can work together on?
Mr Carson.
If the Cabinet Secretary wants to get to the closing of my contribution, she'll hear some of the suggestions we had in our manifesto. But the criticism is not just coming from these benches. Last session's Rural Affairs and Islands Committee heard it clearly. Stakeholders spoke of an ambition versus reality gap, warning that delivery had been too slow and that confidence across sector has been eroded. Professor Dave Ray told the committee that without a proper rural support plan, clear policies and a budget, it's really hard to see how climate change will be delivered. That sums up the problem perfectly: ambition without delivery. And we see that gap across sector after sector. We see it in forestry, where woodland creation is now falling short of even reduced targets, following significant cuts in the support scheme. Forestry does not operate on a political timescale, it works over decades. Yet uncertainty in funding and direction has found the consequences that fewer trees are being planted and less confidence across the sector. For example, the decision to cut the forestry grant scheme by 40% has consequences, and Scottish forestry figures will show that less than 8,500 hectares of new woodland was created in 24-25, short of the reduced 10,000 hectare goal and far short of the 18,000 in the climate change plan. We see it in peatland restoration, where the ambition is welcome, but questions remain about whether delivery matches the scale required. The committee heard concerns about a narrow, carbon-driven approach with needed laser focus on the most degraded sites, while wider peatland conditions is overlooked. Witnesses responding to the climate plan warned that the right balance has not yet been struck between short-term emissions and long-gain sustainable restoration. Even in areas where the government highlights success stories, the reality...
Minister.
Given the points that the members just made about peatland restoration, would you welcome the fact that we've actually exceeded the peatland restoration targets for this year?
Finlay Carson.
Yes, but I think if the Minister maybe missed my point, it's not about laser focus on just the restoration, it's the wider implication and where those gains could be made and whether we're actually doing enough. And that was coming from the peat restoration experts. But we need to see agriculture where farmers and crofters do have clarity and certainty for them to plan for the future. So let me be clear, farmers and crofters are not obstacles to climate action, they are essential to it. They manage the land, support biodiversity and produce the food that underpins our national resilience. But they cannot deliver change if policy is unclear, support is uncertain and there's growing perception that active farming is being sidelined. The Rural Support Plan, I think I need to make progress. The Rural Support Plan was meant to provide that clarity. Instead, it has raised further questions. Funding pressures, reduced capital support and a lack of long-term certainty have left many in the sector unsure about what comes next. And that matters, not just for climate policy, but for food security. Because we must be honest, we cannot rely on declining domestic production and increasing imports to make our emission figures look better on paper. That is not climate leadership, that is climate displacement, exporting our emissions while importing food from elsewhere, often with higher carbon costs. I'll give way to the Minister.
Minister.
I'm not quite sure what the member's talking about in terms of the declining production in this country, because we're still producing plenty of food in this country. But he's also talked about the fact that there hasn't been certainty. There's a guarantee of certainty between now and 2030. There's also work ongoing to make sure that we continue with direct payments. So where is it that the member thinks that there isn't certainty? Because the industry, as we've just had for 2 days at the Highland Show, are telling us that they are very comfortable with the direction of travel of this Scottish Government.
The Minister must have been speaking to different farmers. The problem is we know there's action needing to be taken, and this government keep kicking the hard decisions into the long grass. There is no certainty and there's a reducing budget. The same credibility gap, and we've just heard from the Minister's response, exists when it comes to technology and implementation. The Climate Change Plan talks about new machinery, alternative fuels and rapid technological change. But we heard the clear evidence about the cost barriers involved, whether that is low-emission equipment or emerging technologies that are simply not viable or available at scale. You cannot mandate your way past affordability, and you cannot build a credible plan on the assumptions that technology will arrive on time, on budget and at scale without proper support. We must take a more honest and balanced approach to our natural environment. Land management matters, prevention matters, and those working in our countryside, the farmers, gamekeepers, land managers and rural businesses play a vital role. But too often they feel ignored in decision-making, or worse, treated with suspicion. Policies that are imposed without proper engagement risk undermining the very outcomes they seek to achieve. A just transition takes people with it, not leave them behind. And nowhere is the need for honesty clearer than energy policy. A managed transition to net zero must recognise the continuing role of oil and gas. And that's not just a political point, it's an economic and practical reality. North Sea oil and gas supports tens of thousands of skilled jobs. It underpins our energy security, and it provides a domestic supply with a higher environmental standard than any imports. Turning our backs on that resource prematurely will not reduce global demand. It will simply mean importing more energy, often with a higher carbon footprint, while exporting jobs and weakening our economy. That is not a just transition. A credible approach must be combined with investment in renewables and a realistic understanding of current energy needs. Presiding Officer, this debate is about credibility, because people will only support the transition to net zero if they believe it's fair, achievable and grounded in reality. Thank you.
I now call on Sarah Dijkstra-Downey. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In 2021, I spent a week at COP26 in Glasgow. I sat in on hours of negotiations, and it was in one of these large tented rooms filled with people from all across the world that I met Martina. Martina was a delegate from the Democratic Republic of Congo. She and her colleagues were exhausted, trying to keep up with rich countries and influential lobbies. Martina was there not because she was a trained negotiator. She was a teacher, and she spoke English. Now, English is both our second languages, but what we shared was something far more important than a common tongue, a deep concern that the planet is warming, that extreme weather is driving migration, poverty, famine and flooding on a scale the world has not seen before. Now, that was 5 years ago, when it felt like the world was finally waking up to these threats. It feels like a long time ago now. Meanwhile, climate change continues to wreak havoc on communities across the globe and right here at home. Whether you live in Kinshasa or Craigleith, climate change is already affecting all of us. Be it small businesses flooded after torrential downpours that are happening more often, be it farmers struggling with long periods of drought, or coastal communities across Scotland seeing increased erosion and watching sea level rises, this is not a future threat, it is a present reality. Presiding Officer, there is nothing to disagree with in this government motion. Climate change is an emergency. The science is unambiguous. I know, I worked alongside climate scientists for over a decade. This Parliament is right to reaffirm Scotland's commitment to net zero by 2045. And it is right to call out the dangerous and frankly ridiculous stance of climate change deniers. People who spread misinformation, who undermine the evidence base, who prioritise ideology over science. And regrettably, some of that thinking is represented in this very chamber. We will not stand for it, and neither should this Parliament. But, Presiding Officer, we also owe it to the people of Scotland to be honest about where we are. Scotland set ambitious targets. For over a decade, we missed them. Not once, not twice, 8 times in 12 years. The 2030 target, once held up as a world-leading example of climate ambition, was quietly abandoned last year because the Scottish Government's own independent advisers said it was no longer credible. That is not a record to be proud of. It is a record that demands accountability. Now, the climate change plan published earlier this year is a step forward, and we do acknowledge that. But significant gaps remain on decarbonising homes, transport, agriculture and industry. We need action, not aspirations. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Liberal Democrats also believe that Scotland cannot afford to take any low-carbon technology off the table. An evidence-led approach means exactly that, following the evidence, not ideology. That is why we call on the Scottish Government to engage constructively with the UK Government on Scotland's energy future. including the potential role of new and emerging technologies in our energy mix. Scotland's clean energy ambitions must be built on pragmatism as much as principle, and must leave no community behind. And that includes Scotland's North East, an area close to the Cabinet Secretary's own heart. The Liberal Democrats believe that the so-called just transition must be exactly that. It must be just, and it must be a transition, not a cliff edge. The Scottish Government is rightly ambitious on climate, and where they make genuine progress, we of course support that. That is not in question. But to date, progress has been too slow, the targets too often missed, and the excuses too readily offered. It is our role, all of our roles, as an opposition, as a parliament, to hold their feet to the fire. Bold rhetoric is easy, I know that, presiding officer. Bold action is what this parliament and this planet actually needs.
I call Stuart McMillan to be followed by Heather Anderson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, as the recently elected convener for the Climate Action Committee, I'm looking forward to working with colleagues from across the chamber, both scrutinising the Scottish Government, but also, hopefully, with the committee making suggestions to help Scotland in dealing with the climate emergency that we all face. And for clarity, I'm not speaking today as convener of that committee. As some leaders trade the hope and health of future generations for the short-term gains, they push back against the very idea of a climate crisis and undermine the need for urgent action. I've already heard that this afternoon in the debate, but I do urge the Scottish Government, the SNP Scottish Government, not to yield to the climate culture wars. There are millions of people globally who are impacted by climate change today, and that will be the case for future generations, already touched upon by Sana Dijkstra. And it's something that I've heard on numerous occasions when I've represented the Parliament at Commonwealth Parliamentary Association conferences, whether the regional ones or the international ones, which I'm going to come back to in a moment. Now, global warming is one of the biggest issues facing our planet, and the strong leadership on the climate crisis has never been more important. And reaching net zero is a national challenge for Scotland. It's one that we must win for a healthier climate, warmer homes, cleaner air and happier, more equitable, prosperous communities. The motion in the name of the Cabinet Secretary highlights these key criteria, and I'm looking forward to the contributions from MSPs, certainly the open debate this afternoon, as I'm sure will actually help the committee discussions on Thursday as we meet for the first time, but also for the rest of the parliamentary term. But there are three items that I'm just going to touch upon briefly, just for wider consideration. And first of all, that's on the issue of AI data centres and their impact on the environment. There's already a great deal been written about them. And we all use AI, some former MSPs, more than others, of course, but it's not going to go back into the box. It's only going to increase, and it will become more increasingly important for the economy and also social use. So members will also be very much aware of the 24 AI data centres being reported for planning across the country. So we all appreciate how important that this issue actually has become. And I touched upon the CPA a minute ago, and the AI data centres has been an issue that has been raised time again and again and again at the international conferences, but also at the regional conferences. So it's not just us who are talking about it, others are talking about the issue as well. And helpfully, it's actually in the agenda for this year's Festival of Politics event. I know I'm not able to use props, Presiding Officer, but I thought actually plugging the Parliament, I might get away with that one. So there's an event on Thursday, the 27th of August. There's actually two discussions about AI, but one about the actual data centres themselves. So dealing with climate emissions is already a massive challenge, and with newer technologies, we need to find a way to incorporate them into the economic, the social and also the environmental policies that we manage. Now, secondly, is the issue of heat networks and the importance and success of them, delivering the heat that we all need, but also their environmental impact is vital. District heating systems play an important role in communities up and down the country, but they do come in a range of scales. Are they operating effectively? How do we create more using efficient input to ensure communities can benefit from them whilst providing improvements for the customer and also the provider? And thirdly, this is a small example in a business context, and I didn't know about this until yesterday when I met up with a local business. But this isn't just an issue that this local business faces, it's an issue that this particular sector faces UK-wide. And it might be a bit niche for some, but it's to do with cinemas. The technology that cinemas utilise are actually highly power intensive. There is technology already out there to actually go in and help improve this. But the cinemas, actually, they are struggling. They've not yet recovered fully from COVID, particularly when it comes to small-scale operators. In my constituency, I've got one in Greenock. There's two in that business, Greenock and Dunoon. There's also another separate one in Falkirk. That's got one screen. But there are others UK-wide. They're not all part of big multinational conglomerations. So these are it's a small example, but actually where government could actually potentially help, then move the dial somewhat going forward. So, Presiding Officer, today we've already been a range of issues have been discussed, and obviously many more will be. I mean, whether it's regarding the marine environment, whether it's energy generation, oil and gas extraction, agriculture, transport, construction, amongst others. There will be more, and certainly I'm looking forward to the committee and the deliberations that we will have. But fundamentally, we have made progress. It is difficult to get to where we need to get to, but we need to do it, because the impact on us is one thing, but also the impact upon particularly some countries in Africa. Sandy Dykstra spoke about Congo, but many others that I've heard about through the CPA. We've got a job to do. Thank you.
Thank you. I call Heather Anderson to be followed by David Barrett. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I begin by declaring an interest. I'm an elected councillor in Dundee City Council. Presiding Officer, I want to start my speech by stating an inconvenient truth. Climate change is real, it's been an emergency for some time, and it's already affecting communities across Scotland, as we well know. If I could stop it by clicking my heels and denying it 3 times, I would, but that doesn't make it go away. It's already happening. Winters are already wetter, summers are already drier, storms are increasing in frequency and intensity, and unbelievably, droughts are being predicted in Scotland. No, I'm not taking inventing. You got to say a lot of misinformation earlier. I'm carrying on. The 10 warmest years on record here in Scotland have been the hottest in the 10 warmest years on record here in Scotland have been in the last 27 years, with 2022 recorded as Scotland's hottest year ever. 2024 was the UK's warmest year on record, and that record is likely to be broken in the lifetime of this Parliament, if not this year. Limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees isn't a woke mantra. 1.5 degrees isn't a target, it's a limit. If our planet warms up by more than 1.5 degrees, a number of tipping points are breached. Oceans are already warming faster than predicted. Glaciers are melting faster than we'd hoped, and the permafrost is thawing at an alarming rate. And once those tipping points are breached, we run out of road. If we breach these tipping points, we can't control any of it, but we can control it now. And that's why every decision we take in this Parliament must take account of the impact we will have on this place we call home, on our children and on our grandchildren. Continuing to wreck the joint and saying it's someone else's problem is not forgivable or excusable. Presiding Officer, members of this chamber may know that I was a farmer, and farmers don't need to look at the data charts. Farmers live in the weather every day. Harvests were impacted by record-breaking rainfall in 2024. Every farmer knows that the loss of hard frost over winter increases disease burden in the soil. Every grower knows that increasing unpredictability of seasons disrupts cultivation plans. And I just want everyone in this chamber to take a minute to understand that everything we eat was planted or reared by a farmer somewhere. No farmers, no party. For food producers reaching... I'll just finish my line. For food producers, reaching net zero isn't a target, it's a necessity.
Finlay Carson.
Anderson for taking my intervention. Perhaps the member could set out what she believes is a show-stopping policy that has allowed farmers to move quickly towards becoming net zero that this government has introduced in the last 10 years.
Heather Anderson.
Sorry. I'll be guided by the Cabinet Secretary who was here before, but I think the main thing is we're trying to involve farmers in this move to net zero. We're trying to support farmers to survive and diversify the way they rear their animals, the way they farm. We're trying to support active farming, and we're trying to support more organic farming. Okay. And what I was going on to say was we need more organisations like the James Hutton Institute just outside Dundee to develop more climate-resilient plant breeds to contend with increasing unpredictability. And that's why we need to work with nature to enable us to withstand the impact of climate change that's already baked into the 1.5-degree target. And that's where local authorities come in. I always say that local authorities are the fourth emergency service. Whenever there's an adverse weather event, it's the local authority who steps in to support households who have been experiencing flooding, fires or severe heat. Local authorities are also key to ensuring that communities are supported to identify risks and improve climate resilience. In Dundee, we recently updated our climate risk and vulnerability assessment, assessing the impact of a 2-degree or a 4-degree increase in temperature on nature, infrastructure, buildings and people, and it made pretty uncomfortable reading. We've now formed Climate Ready Tayside with Perth and Kinross and Angus councils because we understand that adverse weather events don't respect council boundaries. The group is focusing on nature-based solutions and developing community resilience to future events. They know that once-in-a-generation storms are now occurring on an annual basis. Storm Babette caused devastating flooding across the region, most noticeably in Brecon, but also in Dundee, where the Dichtey burst its banks. Working with nature to re-meander the Dichtey is now a regular topic of debate and a work in progress. And finally, Presiding Officer, in Dundee, thanks to 80% funding support from the Scottish Government, we've also invested in the Broughty Ferry Flood Protection Scheme. And we've combined it with an amazing active travel route, sand dune restoration and wildflowered meadows. Just imagine 2 football pitches full of wildflowers like Viper's blue glass, with the bees buzzing so intensely that people walking stop still in amazement just to listen to the racket. So we're protecting all those homes and all those businesses, getting people out walking, and the bees, bugs and beasties are loving it. That's good work. That's how we tackle climate change.
Member must conclude.
Presiding Officer, Scotland has made great progress towards meeting our net zero targets, and I trust with the renewed focus and with the updated climate change plan, we can finish the job. The Climate Change Committee have said we can do it, so let's get on and do it.
Call David Barrett to be followed by Katie Hagman.
Thank you. I'll begin by referring to my register of interests, which will show that I am a principal hydrologist for Kylo Associates and a councillor in Fife. Presiding Officer, I recently attended a screening of the People's Emergency Briefing. This is a campaign that brings together leading scientists, economists, security experts and communicators to explain the risks posed by climate change and nature loss, and to encourage a more honest public conversation about the scale of the challenge before us. The campaign is also calling on the UK Government to stage a prime-time, multi-channel, televised national emergency briefing to communicate the scale and immediacy of the risks we face. The film perfectly captures the key risks around climate change. I would encourage all members to look up the community screenings that are happening all over Scotland. Just as an example of some of the topics covered by the screening, the price of energy is a major driver for inflation and the cost of living. Renewable energy isn't just better for the planet, it is more economically secure. Our dependency on fossil fuels is responsible for huge economic shocks in recent years. Russia's invasion of Ukraine didn't make wind power more expensive. Trump's war with Iran didn't make solar more costly. Almost 90% of homes in Scotland rely on fossil fuels. It seems fairly obvious, but if we are less reliant on fossil fuels, we will be less exposed to the shocks created by global events. Before entering Parliament, I spent about 15 years working as a hydrologist. During that time, I undertook hundreds of flood risk assessments across the UK for housing and commercial developments and for energy infrastructure. Over those 15 years, I have watched climate change moved from something discussed largely as a future risk to something increasingly reflected in the day-to-day engineering practice. When I started my career, it was common for us to apply a 20% uplift for climate change to account for increased river flow from our calculations or peak rainfall intensities in order to assess future impacts of flooding. Today, depending on the catchment that you're in, that figure can be as high as 59%. So those are changes that are happening now. Those are numbers that are not produced by politicians, they are not produced by campaign groups, they are produced by scientists, engineers and regulators analysing the best available evidence we have today. That evidence points to a clear direction. Weather extremes are becoming more extreme. We are seeing more intense rainfall events, increasing flood risk, longer periods of drought and greater pressure on infrastructure that was never designed for the climate conditions now emerging. That is why I find some of the language that has entered our political discourse in recent weeks and repeated today concerning. We have heard Reform members once again dismiss terms such as climate emergency and climate crisis as faith-based language, rather than descriptions grounded in evidence.
Did the member give way?
Yes.
Finlay Carson.
David Barrett giving away, and can I say welcome to the Parliament. He's one of 3 Galaverians that are in the Parliament now. And I just wonder whether he thinks it's right that constituents in his home constituency of Galloway are subject to huge pylons, not being able to oppose massive wind farms and solar and battery power now covering our landscape, when the local communities should have more say.
David Barrett.
Yeah, I mean, to an extent, I agree with something that Finlay Carson referred to earlier, which was a just transition takes people with it. And I would agree with that. As a former convener of the Planning Committee in Fife, there is a process for commenting and taking part in the democratic process or the planning process that goes along with those. We do need infrastructure. That is part of it. And that's something that is just a reality of the world we are in. But I do understand the point that he is making. We've also heard calls for Scotland to abandon net zero policies from Reform members. I fully accept that there is room for legitimate debate about how we respond to climate change, and we should debate which technologies we invest in, how we support workers through the transition, and how we protect consumers, and how we ensure that policies are fair and effective. But there is a fundamental difference between debating solutions and dismissing the evidence that makes those solutions necessary. As someone who has worked professionally in this field, I do not regard the language of climate emergency as a slogan. It reflects the reality that the risks identified by the science are becoming more serious and more urgent with every passing decade.
The members in his last few minutes, 3 seconds, sorry.
I will not give way. However, I do believe that climate change should not be viewed rather solely through the lens of risk. Challenge also means opportunity. Scotland possesses some of the greatest renewable energy resources in Europe. We have world-class engineering expertise and a highly skilled workforce with enormous potential for offshore energy storage and emerging low-carbon technologies. Investment in renewable energy is not simply about reducing emissions, it is about strengthening our energy security, improving our resilience and creating the jobs of future industries. The National Emergency Briefing asks a simple question. If the evidence points to growing risk, do we respond with urgency or do we bury our heads in the sand? For me, the answer is clear. We should meet the challenges of climate change with honesty about the risks, confidence in the science and optimism about the opportunities before us. If we do that, Scotland will not simply adapt to a changing world, we can help lead it. Thank you.
I call Katie Hagman to be followed by Paul McLaren. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Before I begin, I would like to put on record how disappointed I have been and frankly staggered by some of the language used in this chamber. To refer to climate change as a faith-based belief is not only baffling and disrespectful, but it is, in my opinion, dangerous, and I won't be taking an intervention. That said, while I recognise and condemn the spread of misinformation as outlined by other speakers in this debate, I am not looking to justify or determine the legitimacy of the climate emergency. The evidence is abundantly clear from the work of countless scientific professionals following evidence and scientific professional advice and research to the experiences of those who are living with both life-changing and life-threatening effects here in Scotland and across the globe. Climate change constitutes a global emergency, and I am glad that we are recognising that today here in our Scottish Parliament. While challenges we face collectively are immense, Scotland has the opportunity to show leadership, and I am proud that the SNP will not shy away from this, but take action. Combining our ambitious net zero targets with our commitment to a just transition and ensuring climate action delivers jobs, investments and fairness for our communities. As set out in the motion, I am drawn to the final paragraph. The transformative opportunities presented by climate action, including significant economic, social, environmental and public health benefits, and acknowledges that delivery of the transition must be fair and inclusive for all. I wholeheartedly agree with this statement and can give a wonderful example of this in relation to the investment in renewables. Within my constituency of Carrick, Cumnock and Doon Valley, many of the communities were built on the back of industry and coal mining. Communities that powered Scotland for generations, yet under successive Conservative governments were abandoned. Industry was torn out with little or no regard for the people who depended on it. Devastation, lost opportunity and a deep sense of betrayal is very much still felt, and I heard this directly from the people on the doorsteps during my campaign. I will give way.
Finlay Carson.
I appreciate Katie Hagan giving way, but if we turn that on its head, what about the total disregard communities, including the one that Katie Hagman used to live in, around about Newton Stewart, where they feel completely and utterly ignored when it comes to having massive renewable infrastructures right on their doorstep? They feel ignored.
Katie Hagman.
So I'm not in this chamber to speak to Dumfries and Galloway. I can put on the record I am a councillor within Dumfries and Galloway, and there is a planning procedure in place, and that is debated. And certainly Dumfries and Galloway Council will make representatives. It's not a situation that I recognise that Mr Carson is referring to. However, when I look at the opportunities brought forward by the investments in the renewables sector, I am delighted to see that communities are being reimagined, they are being revitalised. Locally in CCDV, we have a group of 9 community councils that have agreed to work together. Uniting our communities, investing in our future, that is the line that they use in the 9CC. And it is wonderful to see these former coalfield communities speaking with one collective voice. The 9CC is widely considered an exemplar of best practice in community benefit, and having met with the team on the ground, I can see why. It is strategic in nature, ensuring that instead of working in isolation, funding is invested in long-term regeneration across the whole area, including working with the local council and supporting apprenticeships across businesses. It is fair and transparent, and as the distribution of funds are clear with an agreed framework being used, it is leading the equity and avoiding competition, making sure that everyone benefits. And there is local control and democratic leadership. The decisions are controlled by the community councils themselves, and there's collaboration across communities, strengthening communities and creating a shared voice with greater influence. Put simply, it turns community benefit into long-term fair. I won't, because I'm just finishing up just now, thank you. Ensuring renewable wealth delivers real change for and in the communities who host it. That is the promise of a just transition, real change delivered fairly by and for communities. Now is the time to act, to lead and to deliver for Scotland's future.
Thank you. The last of the open debate speeches, I call Paul McLennan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We are at a moment that will define the future that we leave to our children and our grandchildren. The science is clear, the evidence is all around us, and the window for action is narrowing. Today, we see red weather warnings being issued in the south east of England for extreme heat. It's the second heat wave of the summer, and we're not yet out of June. More extreme weather is battering our farms and communities. Just speak to your farmers. They will tell you that every single year. They will tell you that the issue is getting harder and harder. It's easy to stand here in despair, but I stand here with determination because Scotland needs to rise to the challenge and our communities need to be at the centre of that. I'm proud of what Scotland is already achieving. Scotland has decarbonised its electricity supply faster than almost any other country in Europe. Over 90% of our electricity now comes from renewable sources, a transformation powered by wind, waves and tide that shapes East Lothian shores every single day. In East Lothian, we see both the risks and opportunities more clearly than most. Our beautiful coastline isn't being impacted by climate change. Communities in Cockenzie, Preston Pans and North Berwick know the reality of coastal erosion and flooding. As I said, our farmers are already adapting and changing to weather patterns that affect crops and livestock. But East Lothian is perfectly placed to be a green energy powerhouse. A fourth offers world-class conditions for offshore wind. Now, according to the 2026 ECIU report, the Scottish... Yeah, happy to do so.
Angela Ross.
About the impact of Berwick Bank, which is just off our beautiful coast, which would affect up to, I think, 80,000 birds who they expect to be slaughtered by the turbines.
I wouldn't use that terminology. I've engaged with the Seaford Centre, with RSPB and with local communities on that. It's an active discussion that's ongoing at the moment. Coming back to the speech, I want to come back to the 2026 ECIU report, which talks about the Scottish net zero economy in 2025. East Lothian has one of the highest relative exposures to net zero economy in Scotland. So key statistics, it's worth 6.8% of our local GVA and it supports around 1,380 jobs. Now, that's a significant contributor and employer in East Lothian. This places East Lothian amongst the top areas in Scotland for the importance of green net zero activity. So that makes a real difference to our communities and a real difference to people's livelihoods right now. As I said, it also includes transmission infrastructure, specialist manufacturing and fabrication. Local examples in companies where I've operated are Sunamp, Limac and Hadfab. In terms of this is a stronger relative contribution in many other parts of Scotland and highlights East Lothian's specialisation in green energy transition. In terms of that, the role of heat networks is also key. We've not heard that today as we move forward. I commend the work of Lothian Heat. Now, coming back to one of the other key points about this is 1 in 3 Scottish households can't afford to keep warm. Energy bills keep rising, families and households are struggling while energy companies are profiting. Proposals around about Lothian Heat and heat networks could see over £900 million in regional benefit combating fuel poverty in the region. So again, for me, there's a real fundamental about how we talk about climate change. There are economic opportunities around about that. Hundreds of local jobs already are being developed in East Lothian as well. Energy security obviously is important. We can lower emissions and reduce impact on climate. So green jobs are already making a measurable high-value impact in East Lothian. We've heard today from a few members around about the importance of just transition. And obviously we have our net zero target by 2045. We need to support community energy projects. I think that's incredibly important. Expand active travel networks so people can cycle and walk across countries and our countryside, and back innovation in green hydrogen and carbon capture. We need to push for accelerated deployment of floating offshore wind, refitting of our homes to slash fuel poverty, and new building creation that enhances biodiversity while locking away carbon. None of this is easy. There will be difficult choices. We have to be honest with people and say that meeting our climate targets requires change in how we travel, how we eat our homes and use our land. But change does not mean sacrifice. It can mean warmer homes, it can mean cheaper energy bills, it can mean better health from cleaner air and thousands of local well-paid jobs. A just transition means no community is left behind. We know that Scotland's fans are still tied with decisions made in London. Failure to invest in grid infrastructure by successive UK governments have held Scotland back in that particular area. Successive UK governments have cut support for renewables, delayed vital projects and prioritised short-term politics over long-term survival. This is why independence still remains essential. An independent Scotland would have full control over our vast natural resources, the ability to strike our own international green energy deals and the power to align our immigration, skills and investment policies with urgent needs of the climate emergency. To everyone in this room, the challenge is great, but so is our capacity to meet it. East Lothian has always punched above its weight, from the agricultural revolution to the industrial age. Now we can lead the green revolution. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
We now move to closing speeches, and I call Duncan Dunlop for up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and thank you everyone for your contributions today. I would start by stating there is a climate emergency. And on this point, my namesake across the chamber, Mr Duncan Massey, I'm glad that reform is recognising climate change now exists, but it is an emergency. This is the hottest day we've ever seen in June in the United Kingdom, and year upon year, month upon month, climate targets have been changed. Carry on.
Duncan Massey.
I would just challenge yourself, and indeed the entire chamber, to point to the scientific information, especially from the IPCC, that corroborates this claim of a climate emergency. It doesn't exist. So I would ask you, for every claim that's made in this chamber, to corroborate it with scientific evidence.
Through the chair, please, for interventions and contributions. Duncan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Well, as I just said, it is the hottest day ever recorded in June in London today. That will be beaten again tomorrow and probably the following day. This is evidence before our eyes. We had the same in May. We can see numerous events. You can see the proliferation of having to build flood defences in Dumfries. We've had to do the same in Hawick. I will not carry on that point, so I'm not taking more intervention on that specific bit. Moving on. But it is really relevant to the government to realise that we are in danger of moving goalposts. As was reiterated by my colleague and already said in this debate in Sana Dixter-Downey, it's tragic that we've missing our 2030 interim climate change targets, and 8 out of 12 emissions milestones have been abandoned. We cannot keep moving the goalposts on this. Indeed, the Liberal Democrats with the original Green Party, it's in part why I joined them. We always had ambitious targets in this. It was a Liberal Democrat minister in the first parliamentary session here who set the first renewable electricity targets in Scotland. But targets are meaningless, as Finlay Carson reminded us, unless there is an action plan related to them. And I'll say this numerous times in this session, no doubt. A target has to be related with a plan that says what we're going to do, by when, who will do it and how much it will cost and the change it will deliver. Too frequently, we do not deliver on that. But the main issue I want to sum up with this is we need to take people with us. Certainly.
Cabinet Secretary.
I'd just like to mention, of course, that the climate change plan is effectively that route map. It might be slim in the bulk of the main part of it, but it has many annexes which actually set out plans for every single sector.
Duncan Dunlop.
Great, and I look forward to seeing how we actually follow through and deliver upon them as they reach to those who are responsible for that. I would also note on this issue, my main issue is around how do we take people with us. On this, I slightly differ to what Mark Ruskell said in terms of there's still significant public interest in this. I don't think there is, like there used to be. I'm worried that climate change is being seen as a trend that we can move on from. And it shouldn't be. It is a crucial issue that will be pervasive through all of our lifetimes and those in the future. And the one point I would recognise is young people certainly recognise that, and it is the main fear from them. And I agree with David Barrett in terms of seeing the people's emergency screening, that we need to see more of that right across our country, so it's pervasive as another tool to help us do that. But moving on beyond this, I would say, please, as political parties, make sure we reinforce that this is a key message for you, and I'd particularly look at the Green Party for that. Don't get distracted by other issues. You were always seen when you came onto the fore that the environment and driving forward the climate emergency was part of your mandate. It would be good to see more of that. So, in other areas I would like to look at, though, is what I'm worried about, particularly when I knocked on thousands of doors, how rarely this came up as a top priority. And one of the main issues that was also discussed by several members in this was around what's happening with renewable energy infrastructure, particularly in our rural communities, in the Highlands of Scotland and right across the south of Scotland. They feel as though this is happening to them and not with them. People who are naturally inclined to support movements towards the net zero ambitions and the industry we require around it are feeling as though this is imposed upon them. We need to be much more ambitious in this. In Scotland, we're getting about, and I'm sad to pick this up with Kate Hagman, only about £30 million in 2025 was given to community benefit projects. That is tragic when you look at the industry's worth £100 billion. 0.03% of investment is paltry, and we've got to do better than that and be ambitious in our thinking in terms of how we're going to take people with us. We need a national plan urgently, and this is in the Scottish Government's powers, in terms of what do we need in terms of energy, renewable energy infrastructure, what do we need, where and how much per region, and that will give security and continuity for people. But people also want to know within that what they can get from it. Community benefit should be community ownership in part. Where is ambition for this? We talk about Norwegian sovereign wealth funds. What about community sovereign wealth funds so they can really invest and we can overcome rural poverty and we can really help sustainability thrive in that area again? Far less giving them access to free electricity. So I urge ministers, let's please lead. I like the tone of where we're going with this, but hear and engage our communities going forward, as this is a national emergency for all of us. Thank you.
Paul Finlay-Carson, up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This has been an important and wide-ranging debate, and I thank members across the Chamber for their contributions. There is common ground. We recognise the reality and impacts of climate change, we support climate action, and we support Scotland's ambition, well, most of us, to reach net zero by 2045. But the issue highlighted throughout this debate is not ambition, it's whether that ambition is backed by credible and deliverable policy. Too often we hear that from the Scottish Government, what we hear is overly optimistic and progress that isn't really reflected in reality. Scotland has missed emission targets in 8 of the past 12 years, and the 2030 interim target has been abandoned. Progress has stalled in key sectors, including transport, buildings and agriculture. So when ministers highlight success, it's isolated, and they risk obscuring the central problem, and that's the gap between ambition and delivery. And that matters because public confidence depends on targets being credible, achievable and backed by real plans. Sorry, I don't have time. Apologies. We saw that clearly in the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee, where witnesses pointed to a gap of ambition and implementation and a lack of detailed policies needed to deliver. Because reaching net zero will require significant changes across our economy with real costs and trade-offs. That change must happen over timescales that are practical and achievable. Move too slow and we fail to act. Move too quickly without a plan and we risk damaging rural communities, businesses and our wider economy.
Cabinet Secretary.
I asked Finlay-Carson in his first speech whether he would outline policies from the Conservatives that we can maybe discuss on which we could actually see emissions reduction. Specifically on land use, what policies do the Conservatives want to bring forward that we see emissions reduction in the rural spaces and the land use?
Finlay-Carson.
Very briefly, given I took 3 interventions the last time, I actually run out of time to tell you, but one of them is we wanted to see an increase in the budget by 50 million, which would address some of these issues, rather than a year-on-year cut that we've seen from the SNP government. So, getting the balance right is essential, and we heard that clearly today. Claire Baker raised concerns about the continued reduction in livestock numbers and what that means for rural Scotland, and Heather Anderson, in a thoughtful contribution, reflected the experience of many in the sector. However, she found it difficult to point to a clear practical policy that genuinely supports farmers in making that transition. And that's the issue. While change is happening, there is no clear roadmap to support it, and that risks becoming unmanaged decline. Also welcome David Barrett's recognition of the challenges facing communities in areas like Galloway, where large-scale wind, solar and battery developments and the infrastructure that comes with them are having a growing impact. But I was particularly disappointed that Katie Hagman failed to recognise those concerns, especially when she represents a community that for many years, through campaigns like Hands Off Our Hills, have felt increasingly ignored by our own government. Presiding officers, we also heard from Mr Massey. Yes, I will. I'll get the time back.
So what I would just add into the debate, and I would just highlight to Finlay-Carson, that while yes, there are some campaign groups that are very, very loud, what is often not heard is the hundreds of young people that come to me that want to support green policies. So while it's great to listen to one side of the argument, I would invite the member to listen to both sides of the argument.
Finlay-Carson.
Thanks for the intervention. I think we do. I don't think there's any denying that everyone sees renewables as part of our future, but having areas of Galloway industrialised by massive turbines against the vast majority of people in the community is just not acceptable. Duncan Massey contributed. But I don't believe the task before us is simply to challenge the science. It's to respond to the science with realistic timescales, practical policies and credible plans. Because climate policy cannot exist in isolation from economic realities. We must recognise the role of domestic oil and gas as part of a transition and support those already delivering for our environment across rural Scotland. The Scottish Conservatives support action on climate change, but it must be credible, affordable and deliverable. That is the approach set out in our amendment, because at present we have a government failing to meet its targets, failing to deliver a truly just transition and failing to provide the clear plan that people and businesses need. Ambition without delivery is failure, and Scotland can't afford any more failure.
Thank you. I call Ariane Burgess. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, I started working on climate change and nature restoration in New York City in the 1990s. And when I came back to live in Scotland, I was heartened because I arrived in a country where the people of Scotland, through the Parliament and the government at that time, had recognised the science-based evidence on climate change. And it is good to hear the Cabinet Secretary today stand in this chamber and recognise it as well. And I hear that again across the chamber from colleagues. And then in 2019, the Parliament unanimously delivered a climate emergency, called that out. And this emergency was supposed to increase the rollout of net zero policies, things like better buses, safer active travel and retrofitting of our homes to make them warmer and cheaper to heat. But why, 6 years on, with less than 4 years to 2030, am I hearing from countless people who know what's at stake that the urgent change we need to see isn't happening fast enough? And I will give that we have done an incredible amount of work in terms of energy. But there are other areas that we need to be moving at much more rapid pace. And we heard from MSPs across the chamber, Sana Dixter-Downey, Heather Anderson, David Barrett, Duncan Dumlett, all talking about the wildfires and the floods that are really demonstrating to us that we need critical action. I heard from the Cabinet Secretary talking about this is going to be the parliamentary session of action, that we have the climate change plan. But having sat on two committees in the last session, the Rural Affairs Committee and the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee, to scrutinise that climate change plan, we heard from countless stakeholders giving evidence saying that they didn't feel confident that there was an adequate delivery plan. This 5-year Parliament is our last chance to get it right. We need absolutely bold climate change action. And I welcome, again, the Cabinet Secretary's focus on that. But we've got to bring about a secure transition that is just and fair, that delivers for the people of Scotland, delivers greener, more affordable futures, well-paid jobs in the renewable energy. That's been talked about all of the last 5 years. I'm needing to see more of that. Accessible public transport. Again, where is that really happening on the ground? In my rural and island communities, it's really hard to find a bus sometimes. And we need that clean heating, those clean heating systems that our EU neighbours have enjoyed for decades. And of course, we also need that thriving natural environment, which is going to be the key to supporting us to adapt to climate change. Every sector of the economy and society is going to have to play its part. But critically, as has been stated by numerous colleagues this afternoon, in transport, in the heat and buildings area and in agriculture, this is where we need to see rapid action. And I'm going to focus some more comments on agriculture. Having just had a fantastic 2 days at the Royal Highland Show, we have the ARC Act, the Agriculture and Rural Communities Act. We have the Rural Support Plan. And we know that agriculture and land use plays such a vital role in the work that we need to do to bring our emissions down. The Scottish Greens campaigned on the idea of an agricultural transition insurance fund. We were saying we'd like to see £500 million of the agricultural budget put into that fund. And the reason we want to do that is because farmers need that certainty. We are now at a point where we are in unknown territory of what we're doing with our land use. And we need to give them certainty that when they take that action, and if it fails, they have the support to take it forward. So one of the things I noticed in the Rural Support Plan, and I do need to look at it in more depth, is that it seems to indicate that food production is here and nature restoration is something else. Two separate streams of activity. But I have met farmers who are pioneers. They give me hope. They give me hope because they have recognised that it is a stacked function, that the methods that they can use to grow food will actually allow us to have nature regenerate. So we've got to be supporting farmers to move to nature-friendly regenerative farming. Those pioneers have moved away from nitrogen use. They understand their soil biology. They are choosing smaller herds and mob grazing. We have legislated for regenerative agriculture. We do not have the underpinning training, and that's why I called on the Minister in the last session, and will continue to do so, that we need a skills pipeline in regenerative agriculture so that we can bring new entrants into the system and support existing farmers to transition with confidence. And that training needs to be farmer-led and based on farm clusters. We cannot fitter around with the CATIF funding here and there sporadic. We need that absolute pipeline. The other point that I just briefly want to touch on is, and it is connected to what David Barrett brought up around the National Emergency Briefing. In January, the UK government National Security Assessment of Global Biodiversity came out, and it talked about the collapse will impair the ecosystem's ability to provide vital services, including clean water, food and production, and climate regulation. This should be another blue light flashing very fast and hard for the government to move even faster and more swiftly. One of the things, though, that gave me hope when we were looking at the climate change plan over the last session is in the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee, because I thought, how the heck are we going to do it? The farmers that are pioneers give me hope, and the other people, to conclude, who give me hope are the people in local government who have got their sleeves already rolled up. They know what they need to do, but they need government funding to bring about action at a local level. Those are the people throughout the public sector who are ready to take action. They just need the government to give them the funding and support them to do it. Thank you.
I call Angela Ross. 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. There is a failure at the heart of modern politics, the belief that a policy wrapped in virtue should be spared from scrutiny. The people of Scotland expect those who govern to prove their case, to show their evidence and to demonstrate that every decision strengthens our people and doesn't weaken them. The present political push haven't got far, but go on then.
You noted pointing to evidence, and the National River Flow Archive, which is the UK's official river flow archive, has robust evidence that shows that there is an upward trend in peak river flow data sets. Do you accept your colleague is wrong?
Angela Ross.
Thank you. I'm not here to talk for my colleague right now. And when you say peak data flow, are you saying there's an increase in rise in rivers? Okay, so I live locally to Musselburgh, and in 1948 we had the worst flood of the River Esk, and it's marked on a wall. You can go and look at it for yourself. We've had flooding for an awful long time. So the present political push for net zero targets and rush to implement renewables without proper infrastructure and at higher cost due to things like curtailment costs, while dropping oil and gas licences overnight and blocking nuclear, this is ruining our economy. This is what is at the heart of our concern, and we want to ensure people get a fair and just energy transition. I think most people would agree that we don't want the public or businesses to suffer or struggle. We must find ways forward and not get caught up in circular debates. Go on then.
Alan Brown.
Thank her for giving way again. In terms of nuclear, can she explain the current cost of Hinkley Point C, projected costs for Sizewell C and tell us how not spending more money like that is somehow ruining the economy.
Just say to the member, thank you for your point. And Torness, which is near me, contributes 45 million to the local economy. That's going to be gone when you switch it off in 2030. Thank you. I think most people would agree we don't want the public to suffer. We've talked about that. We owe it to them to find solutions. As I say, we can't be doing these circular debates and arguments around one thing or the other. We need to move forward. As someone who's been in the public very recently and just moved into politics, I'm actually tired of hearing circular debates. This is less about whether we trust the science and more about whether we trust what the government is doing with the science. And in this light, it's important to consider how the science is presented to us, who interprets it for policy, which assumptions and benchmarks are chosen, and whether the resulting decisions are proportionate and transparent and practical for Scotland's economy, infrastructure and our communities. The Climate Change Committee, for example, is an independent statutory group, mainly scientists who advise the Scottish Government. But they're funded in part by the Scottish Government, and the person that oversees that committee is our very own Secretary of State for Energy Scrutiny and Net Zero at Westminster. Can we trust that to be truly impartial? Think of some of those optics. Now, it may surprise you to learn, but I'm actually somebody who studied environmental archaeology and paleoecology at Edinburgh University. I know about science, I know about data, and I know about interpreting it. I studied core samples extracted from the ground. I'm going to make some progress just so I don't keep us here too late, sorry. I studied core samples extracted from the ground in Scotland, not far from here, and used dendrochronology, entomology, pollen samples to actually determine climate patterns. I learnt for myself that the climate is dynamic. It does change. And we've seen dramatic changes over expansive phases of time. There are two key points, though, I want to raise from the recent Scotland's Carbon Budgets report by the Climate Change Committee. First, the temperature graph on page 21, which I know you can refer to later, shows a gradual rise in the mid-1800s around the start of the main phase of industrialisation, with an increase of roughly 1 degree centigrade. An uptick then occurred over the last 50 years. We note that this is an increase. We are in agreement that there has been some correlation, but we should also keep it in proportion. A 1 degree change in global average is significant, but not in of itself an argument for policy at any price. It should not prompt anything other than careful, practical, transparent decision-making. Yes, I'll take an intervention.
Thank you. Thank you for taking an intervention. Does the member accept that there is a cost to inaction if we don't tackle the climate change? The UK Climate Change Committee reported last month that inaction to adapt is predicted to cost us between 1% and 5% of UK GDP, which is between 60 and 260 billion per year if we don't act. And we're seeing it today: disruption to travel, damage to property and infrastructure, and in extreme cases, risk to life. There is a cost to that.
Angela Ross. Thank you for the member for their intervention. And I just want to say that we are more concerned about the rate and speed that we have been dropped off a cliff edge, if you like, financially, where we have switched so fast from what we had before to what we are looking at in the future. We didn't even have the right infrastructure in place to store energy and transmit it from these new renewables. That is our concern, but thank you for your point. We need to prompt careful, practical and transparent decision-making and not panic with slogans or policies that weaken the very people we are meant to protect. We can recognise the data and still do better about how we respond to it. The benchmark used in the CCC's framework is the international goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. I know that's part of your motion. My concern is how that benchmark is applied in policy and whether the assumptions behind it are presented with enough context, transparency and realism. But we must keep in mind that the pre-industrial phase sits at the end of what's known as the Little Ice Age.
and it's not as cute as it sounds. It was a period from 1300 to 1840 when Scotland endured colder winters, shorter growing seasons, frozen rivers and real hardship that we have not seen in modern times. We know this from the archaeological and written records. The Little Ice Age was driven by lower solar energy, increased volcanic eruptions and changes in ocean circulation and natural climatic variability. Yet today we're told we must hold global temperatures to within 1.5 degrees centigrade of that period, as if nature were a thermostat. That benchmark represents an extremely cold phase that wouldn't align with modern society, and it feels like a profound oversimplification of a complex dynamic system. And the bottom line is this: it's impossible to hold a constant within a dynamic system. Secondly, I'll just draw your attention to page 39 of the Carbon Budget Report. It shows a steep fall, which has been mentioned by the Cabinet Secretary earlier, in Scotland's greenhouse gas emissions, a steep fall between 2000 and 2019. Some of that reduction, as we've heard, came from a move away from coal, but some of it also reflects a wider and deliberate economic shift, deindustrialisation and the movement of production, and therefore emissions going overseas. In other words, we've not always cut emissions so much as to move them out of sight.
The member must come to a conclusion.
Of course. I'll just skip a few bits then. But that, I just want to say, is it really an emergency when for the last 2 decades we have seen such a significant drop? That emission target, that has dropped. I just moved to near the end, so let's be clear. The real crisis that people feel today is financial. When energy bills are high and 23% of cost covers subsidies and green levies, businesses and families are really feeling the strain. That catastrophic deindustrialisation that we've seen has removed jobs and the opportunity for self-sufficiency and growth. But I do want to move to something slightly more positive. And it was actually the member must come to a conclusion. I'm wrapping up. He said that the debate on climate change is irrational, and I couldn't agree more. We must step over the head-butting arguments about whether it exists or not and take a sensible approach to policy, one that doesn't bankrupt us in the pursuit of targets. Thank you.
Call Donald McKinnon up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. My register of interest will show that I run a crofting business in receipt of agricultural support, and I am a shareholder in a common grazings with an interest in peatland restoration. We welcome the Government's motion and the Cabinet Secretary's indication that the Government will support Labour's amendment. We are in a climate emergency, and it is right that this Parliament recognises that and the scale of the challenge in front of us. In our islands, the impact of climate change are not some far-off abstract concept. It is day-to-day life. In Uist, stormier weather and rising sea levels are eating away at the coastline. We are losing bits of our islands, while the same changes threaten the future viability of the causeways linking our communities. Others across the chamber in this debate have talked about the impacts of flooding and fires in their own constituencies. We cannot sit this one out. We must play an active role. The Government motion is correct to highlight the opportunities of taking climate change seriously. We have an abundance of renewable potential in Scotland, but we need to question who is benefiting. The Government talk of Scotland's energy, and we've heard that in debates in this session so far. But the reality is that it is multinational corporations' energy, the same as our oil and gas sector. While I of course welcome the jobs and supply chain growth that comes with that, we have failed to learn the lessons of the past and have allowed our renewable energy potential to be handed over to private businesses and even foreign state-owned companies, while we hope that we have something of what is left behind. The expansion of renewables cannot be at any cost, and we need a more strategic approach to how projects are developed and delivered. Appropriate community benefit must be a part of this, as we heard from Katie Hagman earlier. But ownership matters, and there is a different way to do things. Communities in my constituency have led the way with wholly community-owned schemes, from Barra to Galston. Those projects are helping us meet our climate targets and deliver meaningful change for our communities. But it doesn't stop there. Point and Sandwick Trust and Lewis are using profits from their 9-megawatt wind farm to invest in tree planting and energy efficiency projects, the kind of transformational change that we heard from Duncan Dunlop earlier. However, unlocking the next generation of community energy opportunities is proving challenging. Support from the Scottish Government's CARES Fund, including increased funding from GB Energy, which is rightly being delivered through the existing mechanism, is crucial to developing projects. But access to grid for community projects remains a challenge. These are complex problems, and to see these projects realised will take collaborative working. The Cabinet Secretary engaged constructively with UK counterparts in the last session, and I hope she will encourage her successor in the Energy Brief to do the same. Now, land is critical to meeting our climate ambitions. Emissions from land and land-based industries present enormous opportunities, with peatland restoration, forestry and agriculture presenting the biggest chance for delivery. Work of the Scottish Land Commission has shown that land suitable for planting and natural capital schemes, particularly in our upland areas, saw a dramatic rise in value before falling. We must be cautious about how policy on land use change impacts the land market. The Nature Finance Initiative has not unlocked the private investment to deliver peatland restoration, and uncertainty around carbon markets has held back restoration in some areas. Understanding how best to make public investments in restoration will be key to unlocking more hectares of restoration and avoiding unintended impacts on the land market in the future. Land use change doesn't have to be an either-or. My own sheep at home spend time grazing on a restored peatland. Some of the best examples are when we see shared land use, whether that's sheep on a restored peatland or cattle grazing alongside forestry. If we get this right, we can build landscapes that are more resilient to climate change, reduce land-based emissions and, importantly, take rural communities with us. On agriculture, I am pleased that the Scottish Government has reiterated its commitment not to adopt the Climate Change Committee's recommendation on livestock numbers. But despite this, numbers continue to fall. And this is a risk to the critical mass required to support our agricultural supply chain across the country, a risk to biodiversity that grazing livestock supports, and a risk to our rural communities. That trend must be taken seriously and cannot be viewed as an inevitability that will help us meet targets. Meeting our climate targets will require difficult decisions, but we must be wary of unintended consequences, as I have outlined. If targets are going to be met, then the pace of change must increase. Areas like retrofitting of houses and decarbonising heat and transport will be crucial to making this happen. And meeting these targets is not a nice-to-have. It is essential, and as we have heard today, it is an opportunity. Unlocking the potential of community energy is one of those opportunities. It can contribute to meeting climate targets, while at the same time see significantly more local economic impact than from commercial projects. Community groups in my constituency have shown how this can be done. They need our support to build on that early success and deliver for the future. Thank you.
I call Cabinet Secretary.
How many minutes I've got to check?
Up to 9 minutes.
Up to 9 minutes. Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I move the motion, because I have a feeling that I didn't do it at the start, so belt and braces approach. I've actually very much enjoyed the debate on the whole. I want to say I particularly enjoyed the contribution there from Donald McKinnon, because he has shown, even in just in the 5 or 6 minutes that he spoke, his willingness to work across the shared purposes across these benches, and I warmly welcome that, because, as I've said many times in this chamber already in this session, that the key is going to be delivery, and the delivery is going to have to come from those that share common purpose. Because if we don't do that, we will repeat the mistakes of the last 10 years since I've been in Parliament, where we're obsessed over targets, we all agree on targets, and then when it comes to even the most minute intervention in terms of policy or legislation or support for measures that are in the budget, then we see people falling away from that. We're long past that. And frankly, we are long past the is climate change real debate as well. I totally agree with Mark Roskell. It's exhausting to be revisiting that. The argument's been won. The science is there. And I want to say that some of the quoting from various scientific bodies and advisory bodies, highly respected scientific bodies, who have been advising governments all over the world has been actually quite shameful. And I would imagine that right now the IPCC's ears are burning at some of the ways in which they have been mischaracterised about taking, for example, the 8.5 scenario away. Taking the 8.5 scenario away is not because there's not a climate emergency. It was because pathways to decarbonisation were improving. And they took that away as a result, and indeed the cost of renewable electricity in particular was coming down. I won't, Mr Massey, for fear of getting yourself into trouble with the IPC, because you've misquoted them and you've mischaracterised them enough today, in my view.
No shouting across the chamber.
Mark Ruskell makes the point about future generations, and I would say it's not just future generations that have got the opportunities associated with climate action. It's the current generations, it's the current workforces, and we're seeing it. Every visit that I did as Energy Secretary, many visits that I'm doing now in my new portfolio, I am meeting people who've come from the traditional industries that have been high-carbon industries, and they have moved into new ones as well. The jobs associated and the sectors associated with climate action are some of the fastest-growing areas in not just Scotland but across the world as well. And if we don't get involved in the climate action activities, the march will be stolen by other countries who absolutely do. Finlay Carson, I asked Finlay Carson for suggestions on what the Conservatives would want to see that would reduce emissions. I'm afraid spend more money was not what I had in mind. It was actual actions, policy actions. I am serious. I want to work with people. And I also would say gently that the forestry grant is actually increased on previous years, 57 million forestry grant in this year. I want to get some responses to agri-environment climate scheme as well. 350 million going out the door to our farmers to help them decarbonise, which I think was one of the interventions that Mr Carson tried to make and my colleague Heather Anderson. I also want to welcome the contribution from Sana Dixter-Downey. This is the first time I think we've been in a debate together. We're meeting, I think, tomorrow to go over our shared objectives as we go. And she mentioned about resilience and community resilience in particular, and she mentioned the various areas that she represents. I would highly recommend that she goes to Inverleith Park and ask for a discussion on the Ferns payments. They were able to leverage in private finance as well and have a nature-based solution for some of the flooding issues in there. And talking of flooding and nature-based solutions, a number of members have mentioned how important they are. Heather Anderson talked about resilience and community. She talked about the Brodie Ferry Flood Protection Scheme, which uses nature in order to do the job of a drainage system, in order to do the job to soak up that excess water. And these are real impacts, real things that affect people, and they're devastating things that affect people. Flooding is not something that we can ignore. Flooding is a result, increased flooding as a result. Bizarre weather patterns as a result of climate change means that we're having more flash floods. So it's not just floods expected in winter, we're having flash floods in summer as well. And we're also having wildfires in places of Scotland and places of the world that never had them before as well. So we need to improve our resilience to that. I also very much enjoyed David Barrett's speech, resilience building and mentioning the opportunity. Although I can gently say to the Chamber, jobs associated with climate action are not just jobs in renewables. That's a very small part. I would say that Duncan Massey did underestimate the amount of jobs associated with renewables. I think it's twice what he mentioned. But all the same, we've got jobs in land management, forestry, in academia, in research, thousands of biofuels, wildlife management, peatland restoration, waste management, circular economy businesses, manufacturing of low-carbon products, structural engineering. Reams and reams of jobs that have nothing to do with renewables. And renewables is a very big part in our decarbonisation journey, but most of the decarbonisation associated with our energy has already been done. The heavy lifting is having to come from the decarbonisation of transport, on buildings, on land use. Those are the areas in which the climate change plan is set out in March. Absolutely prioritise action in those areas, in particular in transport, and I look forward to working with colleagues on how we do that. Paul McLennan was the only person to mention heat networks, I think. I'm sorry if I've I heard from Stuart McMillan as well. Heat networks are going to be absolutely critical, and there are major opportunities in ridding Scotland of the scourge of fuel poverty. And this is the thing we need to bring together. Those things that affect individuals will see off those who would want to deny that climate action is unnecessary. I'll take Duncan Dunlop.
Duncan Dunlop.
I hear what you're saying about heat networks, and very much in agreement, having lived in 2 post-communist cities that were served very well by them. But some of the major heat we will get are from data centres that are being proposed. Do they not therefore need to be relatively near industrial zones or near accommodation that can use that heat?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I mean, the heat networks will be the solution for a lot of urban areas and a lot of towns in Scotland, but they won't be the solution for everyone. So if we're able to install more heat networks in the highly populated areas, then we're able to use some of the government money that we have on the heat systems that would go in, like heat pumps for the more rural areas as well. And many of those areas are the most fuel poor because they are not connected to the gas grid as well, so they've not been able to take advantage of a lower gas price. And also the situation in the Middle East has shown us once again that we cannot afford to be exposed to international energy shocks. We've had wake-up call after wake-up call on this issue. And then this year we had a situation where the price at the pump was astronomical. Businesses were finding it very, very difficult to keep their head above water. Farming businesses in particular, red diesel, the cost of red diesel. We need to reduce, not even necessarily, we're talking about the wrong thing. Energy production is one thing. We need to reduce our reliance on the burning of fossil fuels. That is where we reduce our, I suppose, our exposure to global shocks, but that's also where we'll have economic growth and we'll have action on the cost of living as well. I mentioned before that in the last, since 1990, we have seen a 50% reduction on emissions, but we've also seen massive growth at the same time. The two are not mutually exclusive. I will.
Finlay Carson.
Intervention. I'm going to take us back somewhere, but does the Cabinet Secretary not accept that without honesty and realism, there is a risk of losing public confidence in the entire move to net zero? So, for example, why has the Cabinet Secretary got her head in the sand when it comes to the impact of slashing the Woodland Grant Scheme in 24-25 and what impact it had in confidence in the sector, where we see a target of 18,000 hectares when the most recent figures suggest there was only 8,000 planted? That budget was for 1 year but had multi-year impact.
With Finlay Carson on the whole, and we had a very constructive meeting, I thought, last week. But I will not be called dishonest in this chamber. I have already set out that the £57 million of forestry grant for 26-27. If Finlay Carson wants to talk about a year in the past in which it was lower and obsess over that, fine. I am moving forward. We have secured that money, and I will not be called dishonest by Finlay Carson or anyone else. And I believe I'm in my last minute. A few people, before I sit down, a few people mentioned CARES funding, and there's 15 million annually to keep up with rising demand, but we're also taking action in getting communities available to bid for repowering schemes as well. Forestry Lands Scotland have repowering opportunities and we are making sure that communities are first in the queue to take advantage of them, supported by CARES. There's so much more to say. There's so many actions that we need to be taken forward in order to meet our climate change targets. But the targets are one thing. The economic growth, the public health resilience and the opportunities for Scotland are vast. That is what I want to concentrate on, and I want to concentrate on that with people who want to come with me with solutions. I will close by saying this government to reducing emissions through a fair and just transition, increasing our climate resilience and capturing the economic, social and other benefits of Scotland remains unwavering. I look forward to continuing to deliver on this for both people and planet with fellow travellers. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That concludes the debate on meeting the challenge of climate change. We now move to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion 454 in the name of Tom Arthur on a motion of legislative consent for the steel industry, Nationalisation Bill UK legislation. I'll just leave a minute to allow the Minister and others to put themselves into position. But meanwhile, I'd invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now.